Tonight, let us settle into a quieter corner of history. As the day releases its hold and the world softens around us, I invite you to listen gently, without urgency, as we begin tonight's story. This is a story shaped by oceans and winds, by lantern light on wooden decks, by long nights beneath unfamiliar stars. It is a story that unfolded slowly across centuries, carried by tides that seemed endless to those who watched them pass. Tonight's topic is the Atlantic slave trade. I speak softly now, not to lessen the weight of what occurred, but to allow space for reflection, for understanding, and for rest. History does not always arrive with shouting voices. Often, it drifts toward us like the hush of waves against a distant shore, steady and unrelenting, asking only that we listen. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean at dusk. Its surface darkens into deep blues and grays, the horizon barely visible as the sun lowers itself into the water. For generations, this ocean served as a vast passageway, connecting continents that had long known one another through trade, exploration, and curiosity. Over time, that same passage became something far heavier, a route of forced movement, loss, and transformation that reshaped the world in lasting ways. In tonight's story, we will move slowly. There is no need to rush. We will trace how this system began, not all at once, but through a series of choices made quietly and repeatedly. We will explore how ports grew busy, how ships were built with intention, how laws and customs hardened into routines. We will listen for the voices that history often muffles, the human lives carried across water and time, whose presence changed every shore they touched. As background historian, I will guide you gently, not as a lecturer, but as a companion walking beside you. Together, we will observe rather than confront, reflect rather than react. The aim is not shock, but understanding. Not noise, but clarity. You may picture candlelight flickering in a harbor office, maps spread across a wooden table, ink drying slowly on paper. You may imagine the sound of ropes creaking, sails catching wind, footsteps pacing decks beneath moonlight. These are the quiet details where history often lives, in between the larger events that textbooks summarize. Throughout this series, we will return again and again to the idea of continuity. How systems persist. How consequences ripple outward long after the initial moment has passed. How people adapt, survive, and reshape the world even under immense constraint. These are not stories that end cleanly. They soften into the present, lingering like echoes. For now, simply breathe and listen. Let your thoughts drift like clouds over water. There is nothing you need to remember perfectly. Nothing you need to resolve tonight. As we move gently onward, we will begin at the beginning. At the early Atlantic world, where trade routes first formed, where empires expanded slowly, and where the stage was quietly set for one of the most consequential systems in human history. In the stillness of the evening, let us drift softly into Part 1. Part 1. The Atlantic world before the crossing. As the night settles more deeply around us, let us begin slowly, as history itself often does. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with a gradual unfolding. Long before the Atlantic slave trade became a vast and brutal system, the Atlantic Ocean was already alive with movement, rhythm, and quiet exchange. Its waters carried fishing boats, merchant ships, explorers, letters, and ideas. It breathed steadily, indifferent to human intention, yet endlessly shaped by it. I imagine standing on a shoreline in the late 15th century, long before the world knew the full weight of what was to come. The air smells of salt and wood smoke. Waves roll in with patient consistency, smoothing the sand again and again. The ocean does not announce its future. It never does. It simply waits. On the eastern side of the Atlantic, along the coasts of West and Central Africa, societies thrived in complex and varied ways. Kingdoms rose and fell. Trade routes stretched inland and outward. Markets hummed with conversation, negotiation, and familiar ritual. Gold, salt, ivory, cloth, and ideas moved between regions. Rivers served as roads. Oral histories carried memory from one generation to the next. Life here was not static. It was dynamic, layered, and deeply human. At the same time, on the western edge of Europe, nations like Portugal and Spain were looking outward. Their harbors were busy places, crowded with ships that smelled of tar and rope, their hulls pressed close together as sailors shouted and merchants counted. These coastal kingdoms had long histories of trade across land and sea, but now their gaze lingered on the open Atlantic, wide and uncertain. Navigation improved slowly. Maps grew more confident. Ships became sturdier, able to endure longer voyages. What had once been terrifying expanses of unknown water became routes, lines drawn across parchment with careful ink. Exploration, at first, carried the language of curiosity and opportunity. Spices. Gold. Souls to convert. Each motivation led upon the next. The Atlantic world began to knit itself together not all at once, but stitch by stitch. On the western side of the ocean, the Americas existed in their own complexity, with societies that had shaped their environments for centuries. When Europeans arrived, they did not enter empty lands, though they often wrote as if they had. They stepped into worlds already full, and their arrival disrupted everything. Disease traveled faster than intention. Entire communities were weakened before words were exchanged. Labor systems collapsed under loss, and colonial ambitions pressed forward relentlessly. It is here, in this quiet convergence of forces, that the conditions for the Atlantic slave trade began to form. European colonies in the Americas demanded labor. The land was vast, the ambitions enormous. Sugar plantations spread across the Caribbean, their fields shimmering under harsh sun. Tobacco, cotton, and later coffee promised wealth beyond imagination, but only if someone else did the work. Indigenous populations, already devastated by disease and violence, could not be exploited at the scale colonial powers desired. The solution, framed coldly and efficiently, was forced labor from elsewhere. Across the Atlantic, European traders had already been interacting with African coastal societies. Early exchanges included goods and, gradually, people. Enslavement existed within Africa long before Europeans arrived, but it operated under vastly different conditions. It was not racialized in the modern sense. It was not industrialized. It did not stretch across oceans as a permanent condition inherited by generations. What the Atlantic system would become was something else entirely. At first, the trade in enslaved Africans grew quietly. A ship here. A contract there. Names recorded as numbers. Human beings redefined as cargo in ledgers written by candlelight. The language shifted subtly. People became units. Lives became inventory. Distance helped. When suffering is far away, it is easier to make it abstract. Ports along the African coast transformed. Forts were built, not always by force, but through negotiation, alliance, and manipulation. European powers competed with one another, each seeking advantage. Flags changed, but the structures remained. Stone walls rose near beaches where waves had once broken uninterrupted. Cannons pointed outward and inward. In Europe, the system was discussed not as cruelty, but as commerce. Debates focused on efficiency, profit, and regulation. Laws were drafted. Insurance policies written. Ships outfitted specifically for this purpose, their designs altered to hold more bodies in less space. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded slowly enough that each step seemed reasonable to those who took it. I pause here often when telling this story, because this is where the danger lies. Not in monsters, but in ordinary decisions made repeatedly, wrapped in routine and justification. History does not always announce itself as evil. Sometimes it arrives dressed as necessity. Meanwhile, African societies were not passive in this process, nor were they uniformly complicit. The reality was fractured and painful. Some leaders resisted. Others negotiated under pressure. Conflicts between rival groups were intensified by the demand for captives. Entire regions were destabilized as the trade expanded inland, reaching far beyond the coast. Families were torn apart not in a single dramatic sweep, but through constant, grinding loss. A village raid. A forced march. A silence where a voice used to be. Oral histories remember these absences as much as any written record. And always, the ocean waited. Ships departed loaded with goods, crossed the Atlantic, returned heavier with profit. The pattern became known as the triangular trade, though the word triangle feels too neat, too clean. In reality, it was a looping cycle of extraction and suffering, with the Atlantic at its center, bearing witness without judgment. By the early 17th century, the system had hardened. What had begun as experimentation had become infrastructure. Laws now define people as property based on ancestry. Children inherited bondage before they ever saw the world. Race, once a fluid and imprecise concept, became a tool of permanence. And yet, even here, humanity persisted. People resisted in countless ways. Through refusal. Through memory. Through quiet acts of care for one another in impossible conditions. Songs carried rhythm and meaning across languages. Knowledge survived in fragments. Identity endured even when names were stripped away. As background historian, I do not rush past these moments. I linger with them. Because this story is not only about systems and ships. It is about people who lived, felt, remembered, and endured. As this first part draws to a gentle close, I invite you to rest with the image of the Atlantic at night. Moonlight glimmers faintly on the water. Somewhere, far from shore, a ship creaks softly as it moves forward. Somewhere else, a community waits, unaware of what tomorrow will bring. In the stillness that follows, we will drift onward. In Part 2, we will step aboard those ships themselves, not with haste or spectacle, but with quiet attention, listening closely to the world that existed between deck and horizon, between departure and arrival. Part 2. The ships that crossed the water. As we drift gently into the next chapter of our story, the night feels deeper now, quieter. The world beyond your window has slowed. This is a fitting moment to step closer to the Atlantic itself, not from the safety of the shore, but from the narrow, moving space of the ships that crossed it again and again. I do not hurry onto these vessels. I approach them the way history often must, slowly, with care. Picture a harbor just before dawn. The sky is pale, neither dark nor light, suspended in that in-between hour when sound seemed to carry farther. ships rest in the water like sleeping animals, their wooden hulls darkened by salt and time. Ropes creak softly. A lantern sways near the dock, its flame steady but small. These ships were not all alike, but over time, many were built with a shared purpose in mind. Their shapes grew broader, their holds deeper, their interiors altered not for comfort, but for containment. What had once been vessels of exploration or trade were gradually redesigned into instruments of transport measured not in miles, but in bodies. I imagine standing on the deck as the sun begins to rise. The boards beneath my feet are worn smooth by years of movement. Sailors move quietly, performing tasks learned through repetition. This is routine for them. Another voyage. Another crossing. Another set of instructions carried out without reflection, because reflection slows the hands. Below deck, the air is already heavy. The interior of these ships was dark even at midday. Light entered only through small openings, disappearing quickly into shadow. The space was divided and subdivided, platforms stacked close together, leaving little room to sit, less to move. Iron restraints waited in silence. The smell of wood, sweat, and seawater blended into something sour and inescapable. Here, people were packed tightly, arranged according to calculations made far away, in offices that never smelled like this. Ledgers dictated how many bodies a ship could carry before profit diminished. Mortality was expected. Loss was accounted for. Human life was reduced to risk management. I lower my voice here, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. The Middle Passage, as this crossing came to be known, was not a single experience. It varied by ship, by crew, by weather, by time. Some voyages lasted weeks. Others stretched on far longer, stalled by wind or storms. But certain realities remained constant. Confinement, heat, darkness, fear. For those forced aboard, the journey began long before the ocean appeared. It began with capture, with forced marches to the coast, with imprisonment in holding areas near the shore. By the time they stepped onto the ship, many were already exhausted, injured, grieving. The crossing itself layered suffering upon suffering. Days blurred into nights. The motion of the ship never ceased. Waves struck the hull in steady rhythm, a sound that followed sleep and waking alike. Illness spread easily in close quarters. Fresh water was rationed. Food was unfamiliar and insufficient. Those who became too weak were often deemed expendable. Yet even here, in this most constrained of spaces, life did not disappear. People spoke to one another when they could. They shared names, memories, fragments of home. Languages overlapped and blended, creating new rhythms of sound. Songs emerged, not loud, not defiant, but quiet and persistent, hummed under breath or tapped gently against wood. These small acts were not resistance in the way later histories often celebrate, but they were survival. Above deck, the crew lived in a different world. They watched the horizon, read the sky, argued, laughed, grew bored. For many sailors, this work was brutal in its own way. Disease claimed them too. Storms terrified them. Death was never far. But the hierarchy was absolute. Their suffering did not erase the suffering below. It existed alongside it, separated by boards and belief. Belief mattered enormously. To sustain this system, stories were told. Stories that framed the trade as natural, necessary, even benevolent. Religion was invoked selectively. Science was bent into shape. Race was hardened into a fixed category, something inherited and immutable, used to justify every cruelty that followed. Distance made this easier. Those who invested in voyages rarely saw the ships. Those who passed laws rarely smelled the holds. Those who consumed the goods rarely thought of how they were produced. The Atlantic acted as a vast buffer, absorbing the consequences of decisions made on land. Storms disrupted this illusion. When weather turned violent, the ocean reminded everyone aboard of its indifference. Waves crashed over decks. Sails tore. Water flooded into spaces already overcrowded. In these moments, survival became urgent for all, and hierarchies blurred briefly under fear. But when calm returned, order was restored. Chains were checked. Routines resumed. Some did not survive the crossing. Their bodies were committed to the sea, disappearing beneath the surface without ceremony. The Atlantic holds countless such stories, unmarked and unnamed, resting in its depths. And yet, arrival always came. As land reappeared on the horizon, the atmosphere aboard shifted. Preparations were made. People were brought above deck, sometimes forced to move, to appear healthier than they were. Injuries were hidden when possible. The ship transformed once more, from transport into display. Ports in the Americas waited, their docks ready, their markets prepared. Buyers gathered. Contracts were finalized. The crossing ended, but the system continued seamlessly, as if the ocean itself were only an intermission. I often linger on this moment, the space between arrival and disembarkation. The ship anchored. The water calm. The shore close enough to smell. After weeks or months of confinement, the world suddenly expanded again, though not into freedom. For those who stepped onto land, nothing was familiar. Climate, language, landscape, all different. Names were changed. Identities rewritten. Futures redirected without consent. The ship receded behind them, but its impact followed them forward, shaping every day that came next. As we let Part 2 settle into stillness, I return once more to the ocean at night. The ship is smaller now, a dark silhouette against silver water. The stars above are countless, indifferent witnesses to human suffering and endurance alike. Breathe softly here. Let the waves slow. In Part 3, we will step onto the shores where these ships arrived, into the plantations and ports of the Americas, and listen closely to how life was reshaped there, not only through violence and control, but through adaptation, memory, and quiet persistence. For now, rest gently and drift onward. Part 3. Shorelines of Arrival and the Making of New Worlds. As we continue onward, the night feels settled now, like a blanket drawn carefully around the edges of the room. The ocean, which carried so much of this story across its surface, begins to recede from view, not because it is less important, but because we have reached the other side. The ship has anchored. The long crossing has ended. Land is beneath our feet once more. I step onto the shore quietly, as if sound itself should be respectful here. The ports of the Americas were busy places, though their busyness carried a different rhythm than the harbors of Europe or Africa. The air was warm and heavy, often scented with sugar, tobacco, molasses, damp wood, and sweat. Warehouses lined the docks. Bells rang. Orders were shouted. Animals waited in pens. Ships came and went with mechanical regularity, their arrivals anticipated, their departures scheduled. For those newly arrived from across the Atlantic, this was the first glimpse of a world that would define the rest of their lives. The land was unfamiliar in shape and sound. The sky seemed larger. The heat pressed differently against the skin. Nothing here carried the memory of home, except what was held inside the body and mind. Disembarkation was not a gentle process. People were moved from ship to shore quickly, efficiently, like goods transferred between containers. Inspections followed. Bodies were examined, prodded, assessed. Strength was evaluated. Injuries were noted. The language used was transactional, detached, practiced. Humanity was present, but systematically ignored. I pause here because this moment matters deeply. It is here that the Atlantic slave trade fully transformed from movement into permanence. The crossing was only one stage. What followed was a lifetime of enforced labor, surveillance, and control, embedded into the landscapes of the Americas. Plantations spread outward from these ports, reshaping land as thoroughly as people. Forests were cleared. Swamps drained. Fields laid out in geometric precision. Sugarcane rustled in endless rows. Cotton stretched toward the horizon. Tobacco plants filled the air with sharp, green scent. These landscapes were engineered for extraction, not harmony. Life on plantations followed rigid routines. Days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. Bells or horns dictated movement. Tasks were assigned with little regard for age, health, or endurance. Violence was ever present, sometimes visible, sometimes implied, always understood. Control was maintained through punishment, surveillance, and the deliberate breaking of family ties. Yet even within these conditions, life did not reduce itself to labor alone. People formed relationships. They shared food when possible. They told stories in hushed tones at night. They created music that blended memory and innovation, rhythms carried across the Atlantic and reshaped by new surroundings. Language itself evolved, words from different regions finding common ground, giving rise to new ways of speaking and understanding. Homes, though fragile and temporary, became places of meaning. Gardens were tended when allowed, growing familiar plants or new ones that reminded people of nourishment beyond survival. Spiritual practices adapted, merging belief systems into forms that could endure under watchful eyes. These were not grand rebellions, though rebellions did occur. They were acts of persistence, of refusing to disappear. In cities as well as plantations, enslaved people labored as craftsmen, dock workers, domestic servants, and builders. They constructed the physical foundations of colonial societies, often shaping towns and infrastructure they would never freely inhabit. Streets, buildings, and ports rose through their work, embedding their presence into the very bones of the Americas. Meanwhile, laws tightened around them. Colonial governments codified slavery into legal systems, defining people as property in increasingly precise terms. These laws dictated movement, marriage, punishment, and inheritance. Children inherited status at birth, their futures determined before their first breath. Race became central, rigid, and enforceable, woven into law so deeply that it would persist long after the formal end of slavery. White society organized itself around this system, benefiting from it at every level. Wealth accumulated. Social hierarchy solidified. Everyday comforts were underwritten by forced labor. Sugar-sweetened tea. Cotton-clothed bodies. Tobacco-flavored leisure. Distance and habit made it easy not to ask where these things came from. I find myself returning again and again to the ordinary nature of this world. The most unsettling aspect of the Atlantic slave trade is not only its cruelty, but its normalization. It became part of daily life, folded into routine so completely that questioning it felt disruptive rather than necessary. And yet, questioning never ceased entirely. Resistance took many forms. Some ran away, carving out temporary or permanent communities beyond colonial control. Some sabotaged tools, slowed work, feigned illness. Some preserved knowledge and identity with remarkable care, passing songs, stories, and practices to children born into bondage. Revolts erupted at times, fierce and determined, though often met with overwhelming violence. These acts remind us that history is never one-sided, even when power is heavily imbalanced. Where control exists, so does resistance, even if it must remain quiet to survive. As generations passed, new cultures emerged from this forced convergence. African traditions blended with European and indigenous influences, creating distinct identities that were neither entirely old nor entirely new. Food, music, religion, and language carried these blended histories forward, shaping societies in ways colonizers neither anticipated nor controlled. I linger here, on this idea of creation amid constraint. It does not redeem the system. It does not soften its injustice. But it does remind us of human capacity to endure, adapt, and shape meaning even in the narrowest of spaces. The Atlantic slave trade did not simply move people. It reconfigured the world. Economies grew dependent on it. Political power was reinforced by it. Ideas about race and hierarchy hardened around it. Its legacy stretched forward through centuries, influencing inequalities and identities that persist long after the ships themselves disappeared from the sea. As this part draws to a close, I return once more to a quieter image. Night on a plantation. The air cools slightly after sunset. The fields are still. Somewhere, voices murmur softly. A song drifts upward, barely audible, carried on the warm air. It is not a song of despair, nor of triumph, but of continuity, a thread connecting past and future through the present moment. In the stillness that follows, we breathe. In Part 4, we will widen our view again, stepping back to observe how this system expanded across empires and generations, becoming deeply embedded in global trade and thought, even as opposition slowly began to take shape. For now, rest gently, and let the story carry you onward. Part 4. An empire woven into everyday life. As the night continues to deepen, our story widens its lens. We have walked the shores of arrival and listened to the rhythms of plantation life. Now, we step back, not away from the people within the story, but outward, to see the larger shape of the world that was forming around them. The Atlantic slave trade was never confined to ships and fields alone. It seeped into governments, cities, households, and habits, until it became part of the quiet structure of everyday life across continents. I imagine standing in a European city at the height of this system, perhaps in the 17th or 18th century. The streets are narrow and crowded. Shop windows glow softly with candlelight. Inside, goods from faraway places are arranged carefully. Sugar cones wrapped in paper. Cotton fabrics folded neatly. Tobacco stored in wooden chests. Coffee beans measured and weighed. These items feel ordinary to those who purchase them. Familiar. Comforting. Very few pause to consider the distance these goods traveled, or the hands that made their abundance possible. Wealth generated by the Atlantic slave trade did not remain at the edges of empire. It flowed inward, shaping cities and institutions. Banks expanded. Insurance companies developed new policies to protect investments. Shipbuilders refined their craft. Universities received donations. Churches were constructed. Public buildings rose stone by stone, funded in part by profits extracted from forced labor thousands of miles away. This is how systems endure. They spread themselves thinly, quietly, until no single person feels responsible. Governments played a central role in sustaining this world. Laws regulated trade routes, tariffs, and ownership. Navies protected shipping lanes. Courts enforced contracts and punished resistance. Slavery was not an accidental byproduct of empire. It was a cornerstone, defended through legislation and force alike. In the colonies, administrators refined systems of control. Detailed records were kept. Categories were defined. People were sorted, measured, assigned value. These practices created the illusion of order, masking the violence required to maintain it. Bureaucracy, with its forms and signatures, provided distance from the realities it governed. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, African societies continued to bear the weight of disruption. The demand for enslaved labor did not remain fixed at the coast. It reached inland, reshaping politics and economies far from European sight. Warfare intensified in some regions. Communities fortified themselves or fled. Trust fractured. Entire areas experienced population loss that echoed across generations. The trade fed on instability, and in turn, produced more of it. Yet it is important to linger here without simplifying. Africa was not a single place, nor were its peoples uniform in experience or response. Some regions resisted fiercely. Others were drawn into the system through complex webs of coercion, survival, and rivalry. These dynamics shifted over time, influenced by local histories as much as global demand. History rarely offers clean lines. It offers overlapping pressures, imperfect choices, and consequences that outlast intention. As the Atlantic slave trade expanded, so too did the ideologies that justified it. Writers, philosophers, and scientists produced theories designed to explain why this system existed and why it should continue. Ideas about race hardened into hierarchies presented as natural law. Differences were exaggerated and fixed. Humanity was divided deliberately, with devastating effect. These ideas did not remain confined to books or debates. They filtered into common speech, into jokes and assumptions, into the ways children were taught to see the world. Once absorbed, they proved difficult to dislodge. Even those who never owned enslaved people lived within a culture shaped by these beliefs. And yet, even as this system reached its height, cracks began to appear. Opposition did not emerge suddenly or uniformly. It grew unevenly, quietly, often at great personal risk. Some questioned the morality of slavery through religious conviction, arguing that no person could be owned without violating divine law. Others pointed to the contradictions between ideals of liberty and the realities of bondage. Enslaved people themselves resisted continually, through escape, revolt, and refusal. In ports and cities, small communities of free black people formed, navigating a world that both relied on and restricted them. They worked, worshipped, educated their children, and advocated where possible. Their existence challenged the logic of the system, simply by continuing. I find it important to note that these early challenges did not immediately dismantle the Atlantic slave trade. The system was too profitable, too entrenched. When moral arguments threatened it, economic interests responded forcefully. When revolts occurred, repression followed. Progress, when it came, was slow and contested. Still, the presence of resistance mattered. It disrupted the narrative of inevitability. It reminded the world that this system was constructed, and therefore could be dismantled. As empires expanded, they became increasingly dependent on enslaved labor to maintain their dominance. Competition between European powers intensified. Colonies shifted hands through war and treaty. Yet beneath these geopolitical struggles, the labor system remained remarkably consistent. Different flags flew over the same fields. Different administrators issued the same orders. For those trapped within it, change in ownership rarely meant change in condition. I often think of how time moved within this system. For those in power, years were marked by profits and policy. For those enslaved, time was measured differently. In seasons. In births and deaths. In moments of brief rest. In memories carried quietly forward. The Atlantic slave trade linked continents, but it also created profound disconnection. Families separated by oceans. Cultures fragmented and reassembled. Histories interrupted. And yet, connections persisted in unexpected ways. Through music that crossed boundaries. Through food that blended traditions. Through language shaped by necessity and creativity. These cultural legacies are among the most enduring outcomes of this period, though they exist alongside deep and lasting wounds. As part 4 draws toward rest, I invite you to picture a candlelit room far from the fields and ships. Papers lie on a desk. A pen scratches slowly across parchment. Somewhere, someone is beginning to question the world as it is, not yet knowing how long and difficult the path toward change will be. The room is quiet. The night is still. In Part 5, we will begin to follow these questions more closely, tracing the early movements, ideas, and moments that challenged the Atlantic slave trade and slowly, unevenly, began to imagine a different future. For now, breathe softly. Let the story settle. The ocean remains, steady and vast, holding all that has passed upon its surface. And we drift gently onward. Part 5. The first murmurs of doubt and the long awakening. The night has grown quieter now, as if the world itself is listening more closely. We have traced the shape of an empire built into habit and routine, a system so vast it seemed immovable. And yet, no system remains unquestioned forever. Even the most entrenched structures begin to soften at their edges, not with a crash, but with murmurs. Part 5 is about those murmurs. They did not arrive as thunder. They arrived as uneasy thoughts, as conversations spoken softly after meetings ended, as words written carefully and circulated quietly. They arrived in moments of contradiction, when ideals spoken aloud could no longer be reconciled with realities lived every day. I imagine a small room, perhaps in a city far from the plantations. A fire burns low. Papers are stacked unevenly on a table. Someone sits alone, reading and rereading a passage they have written, unsure whether it will ever be shared. Outside, the world continues unchanged. Inside, something has shifted. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Atlantic slave trade had become foundational to global commerce. Entire economies depended upon it. To question it was to question wealth, power, and identity itself. And yet, questioning began anyway. Some of the earliest voices came from religious communities whose beliefs emphasized inner light, spiritual equality, and moral accountability. For them, the idea that one person could own another sat uneasily with their understanding of faith. At first, objections were personal rather than political. Individual members refused to participate. Others spoke to their congregations, urging reflection rather than confrontation. These early objections did not seek to dismantle the system overnight. They asked something simpler, and in its own way more radical. They asked people to look closely at what had become normal. Elsewhere, enslaved people continued to resist in ways both visible and unseen. Revolts flared and were suppressed, but they left behind fear and memory. Runaways carved paths into forests and mountains, forming communities that existed beyond colonial control. Each act of escape disrupted the illusion that the system was stable or accepted. In cities, free black individuals navigated a narrow and precarious space. Their existence challenged prevailing beliefs about race and capability. Some became writers, preachers, artisans, or activists, using whatever platform they could find to speak against slavery. Their words carried weight precisely because they came from lived experience. I linger here because these voices were often dismissed, silenced, or distorted in their own time. Yet they persisted. They spoke anyway. History remembers them imperfectly, but their presence mattered deeply. As the 18th century unfolded, intellectual currents began to shift. Enlightenment ideas about liberty, natural rights, and human reason circulated widely. Pamphlets crossed borders. Salons and coffee houses buzzed with debate. People argued about the nature of freedom, governance, and the social contract. And quietly, persistently, slavery complicated these discussions. How could societies that celebrated liberty justify bondage? How could nations claim moral authority while profiting from suffering? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they created discomfort, and discomfort is often the beginning of change. Some defenders of the system responded by doubling down. They refined arguments that framed slavery as necessary, inevitable, even beneficial. They pointed to economic dependency. They warned of chaos if the system collapsed. They invoked tradition and fear in equal measure. Others began to imagine alternatives, though often cautiously. Gradual abolition. Regulation. Limits on the trade rather than its immediate end. Compromises that revealed how difficult it was to disentangle morality from profit. Meanwhile, the Atlantic world itself was changing. Revolutions erupted, challenging monarchies and empires. New nations formed, declaring ideals of equality and self-determination. These movements drew inspiration from Enlightenment thought, yet often failed to apply those ideals universally. The contradictions grew sharper. In some places, enslaved people seized these moments of upheaval to push for their own freedom, aligning their struggles with broader revolutionary currents. Their actions forced the question into the open. Freedom could no longer be discussed abstractly when people were demanding it in real time, with real consequences. The Atlantic slave trade, once spoken of primarily in terms of commerce, increasingly became a moral issue in public discourse. Newspapers printed debates. Petitions circulated. Public meetings were held. Images and testimonies exposed realities that had long been hidden behind distance and euphemism. I imagine a reader encountering such material for the first time. Someone who had never seen a plantation, never boarded a slave ship, suddenly confronted with descriptions that lingered uncomfortably in the mind. Perhaps they set the paper aside and stared at the wall. Perhaps they read on, unable to stop. Change does not require everyone to be convinced at once. It requires enough people to become unwilling to look away. This period was not one of simple progress. For every step toward abolition, there were setbacks. Laws were passed and repealed. Movements fractured over strategy and pace. Some opposed the trade while tolerating slavery itself. Others argued for freedom in theory while resisting it in practice. And still, momentum built. The Atlantic slave trade had always relied on silence as much as force. Silence in counting houses. Silence in homes. Silence in places of worship. As that silence broke, even partially, the system began to strain under scrutiny. I think often about the emotional labor involved in this awakening. To acknowledge the truth of the trade required reckoning with complicity, whether direct or indirect. It required admitting that comfort had been built on suffering. These realizations are rarely welcomed. They are resisted, delayed, softened. But once they take hold, they are difficult to fully erase. As Part 5 draws toward its gentle close, I return again to a quieter scene. A letter being folded carefully and sealed. A sermon drafted and redrafted. A conversation whispered between friends late at night. A decision made privately, before it ever becomes public. These moments rarely make headlines, yet they shape the course of history. The Atlantic slave trade would not end quickly nor easily. Its dismantling would take generations, conflict, and compromise. But here, in these early stirrings of doubt and conscience, we see the beginning of that long and uneven journey. In Part 6, we will follow these ideas as they grow more organized and more confrontational, tracing the rise of abolitionist movements and the forces that pushed back against them with equal determination. For now, rest gently. Let the quiet work of change settle in your thoughts. History moves not only through battles and laws, but through minds slowly opening in the stillness of the night. And so, we drift softly onward. Part 6. When voices gathered and the silence broke. The night has deepened further now, and with it, the sense that something is stirring beneath the surface. We have listened to the first murmurs of doubt, the quiet unease that began to trouble a world built on routine and profit. In this part of our journey, those murmurs begin to find one another. Voices that once spoke alone start to gather. Ideas that once flickered privately begin to move outward, carried from room to room, port to port, across borders and oceans. Change rarely arrives as a single moment. More often, it arrives as recognition. A realization that you are not the only one asking these questions. That others, somewhere else, are thinking the same uneasy thoughts. That what once felt isolated now feels shared. I imagine a meeting held in a modest space. Wooden chairs pulled close together. Candles lit carefully, their flame steady but restrained. Papers pass from hand to hand. Someone clears their throat before speaking. The tone is careful, respectful, but there is energy here now, something newly alive. These were the early abolitionist gatherings, not yet unified, not yet powerful, but determined. They formed in different places for different reasons, shaped by local histories and beliefs. Some were grounded in faith, others in philosophy, others in lived experience. What united them was a growing refusal to accept the Atlantic slave trade as inevitable. Pamphlets became a favored tool. Small, portable, inexpensive, they traveled easily. Arguments were laid out in measured language. Moral appeals sat beside economic critiques. Testimonies appeared alongside statistics. These texts did not shout. They reasoned, persuaded, unsettled. Images also began to circulate. Diagrams of ships showing bodies packed tightly below deck. Illustrations meant not to entertain, but to reveal. For many who encountered them, these images lingered far longer than words. They made visible what distance had long concealed. Public meetings followed. Speakers addressed audiences who had never before been asked to consider the human cost of everyday comforts. Reactions varied. Some listened with discomfort. Some with anger. Some with relief, grateful that what they had felt privately was finally being spoken aloud. Not everyone welcomed these voices. Opposition was swift and organized. Those who benefited most from the trade mobilized to defend it. They questioned the credibility of abolitionists. They warned of economic collapse. They invoked fear, suggesting that ending the trade would bring disorder, rebellion, and ruin. Newspapers printed rebuttals. Politicians cautioned against rash action. The debate became public, and with publicity came polarization. In this charged atmosphere, enslaved people continued to act. Their resistance did not wait for permission or legislation. Revolts erupted, sometimes small, sometimes large, always met with brutal suppression. Yet even failed uprisings sent shockwaves through colonial societies. They shattered the narrative of contentment. They revealed the fragility of control. Runaway communities expanded, forming networks of escape and survival. Each successful flight was both a personal triumph and a political statement. Freedom was not merely an abstract concept. It was something people pursued with their bodies, their courage, their lives. I pause here to reflect on the courage this required. To resist openly was to invite punishment. To resist quietly was to live under constant threat. And yet, resistance persisted, shaped by necessity and hope in equal measure. As abolitionist movements grew, they faced difficult questions. How quickly should change occur? Who should lead it? What compromises were acceptable? These debates were not merely strategic. They reflected deeper tensions about race, power, and belonging. Some argued for gradual reform, fearing that abrupt change would destabilize societies built on slavery. Others insisted that delay only prolonged injustice. Enslaved voices, when heard, overwhelmingly demanded immediate freedom, not cautious timelines designed for the comfort of others. These disagreements sometimes fractured movements, slowing progress. Yet they also forced clarity. They demanded that people examine their own motivations and limits. Were they committed to justice, or merely to easing their conscience? Across the Atlantic world, governments could no longer ignore the issue. The trade had become too visible, too contested. Legislative debates unfolded over years, marked by speeches, petitions, and political maneuvering. Votes were counted and recounted. Victories were partial, setbacks frequent. When laws were passed to restrict or end the trade in certain regions, they were often compromised by loopholes and weak enforcement. Smuggling continued. Illegal voyages sailed under false flags. The ocean, vast and difficult to police, remained a conduit for human suffering. And yet, even imperfect laws mattered. They signaled a shift. They acknowledged, at least formally, that the Atlantic slave trade was no longer universally accepted. They emboldened activists. They gave language to dissent. I imagine the emotional landscape of this period. Hope rising and falling. Victories celebrated quietly, aware of their limits. Losses endured with determination rather than resignation. For those who had labored for years without seeing tangible change, perseverance itself became an act of faith. For enslaved communities, these debates were not abstract. Rumors traveled quickly. News of laws passed elsewhere sparked hope and fear in equal measure. Some believed freedom was imminent. Others had seen promises broken too often to trust easily. The distance between legislation and lived reality remained vast. Still, something irreversible had begun. Once a system must defend itself publicly, it has already begun to weaken. The Atlantic slave trade, once spoken of as ordinary commerce, was now forced into moral language. It had to explain itself, justify itself, argue for its own existence. In doing so, it revealed its fragility. As this part of the story settles into the quiet of the night, I return to a simple image. A printing press at rest after hours of work. Ink-stained hands washing carefully. A meeting room emptied of voices, chairs pushed back into place. Outside, the street is calm. Inside minds, questions continue to turn. In Part 7, we will follow the consequences of these growing movements, tracing how the Atlantic slave trade began, unevenly and incompletely, to be dismantled, and how the dismantling reshaped nations, economies, and lives in ways both hopeful and painful. For now, let yourself rest here. The work of history, like the work of conscience, is slow. It moves forward not only through triumph, but through persistence. And so, we drift gently onward. Part 7. The unraveling of a system that refused to let go. The night feels heavier now, not with urgency, but with gravity. We have reached a point in our story where the momentum of centuries begins to shift, slowly, unevenly, like a great wheel resisting change even as hands press against it from every side. The Atlantic slave trade, once defended as permanent and necessary, has entered a long period of unraveling. But unraveling is not the same as ending. Threads loosen, tension shifts, yet the fabric does not fall apart all at once. I want to move gently here, because this is where history often becomes misleading if rushed. It is tempting to imagine abolition as a decisive victory, a moment when the world corrected itself and moved forward. The truth is quieter, more complicated, and far more human. By the early 19th century, pressure against the Atlantic slave trade had reached a point where governments could no longer treat it as a fringe concern. Years of petitions, debates, revolts, and public argument had forced the issue into the center of political life. In some countries, the trade was officially outlawed. Speeches were delivered. Laws were signed. Bells rang in certain cities. Celebrations, careful and restrained, took place among abolitionists who had labored for decades. And yet, the ocean did not fall silent. Ships continued to sail. Some flew false flags. Others departed under cover of night. The trade became illegal in name, but not in practice. Enforcement was inconsistent, underfunded, and often undermined by those who still profited from the system. Corruption softened the edges of law. Distance once again provided cover. I imagine a ship at sea during this period. Its crew tense, alert to the possibility of interception. Below deck, people still confined, still suffering, still carried across the Atlantic under conditions scarcely changed. The law existed somewhere far away, written on paper. Here, on the water, reality followed older rules. This is an uncomfortable truth, and one worth lingering on. The end of the Atlantic slave trade was not a clean break. It was a long erosion, uneven across regions, shaped by power, geography, and will. Some nations enforced bans more aggressively. Others delayed. Some used abolition to assert moral authority while continuing to benefit indirectly. Meanwhile, enslaved people did not wait passively for laws to reach them. Resistance intensified. Revolts became more frequent and more organized. Rumors of freedom spread quickly, carried by sailors, traders, and travelers. Even when incomplete or inaccurate, these rumors mattered. They altered expectations. They made submission harder to maintain. Plantation societies responded with fear. Laws tightened further around enslaved populations. Surveillance increased. Punishments grew harsher. Efforts were made to control movement, communication, and assembly. The system, sensing its own instability, became more rigid, more violent, less flexible. This rigidity was both a sign of strength and of weakness. Strong systems do not need constant reinforcement. Fragile ones do. At the same time, economic shifts were underway. Industrialization began to change the nature of global labor and profit. New technologies altered production. Some argued that enslaved labor was no longer as essential as it once had been. Others insisted it remained indispensable. These debates intertwined with moral arguments, sometimes reinforcing them, sometimes undermining them. Abolitionist movements adapted accordingly. They emphasized not only cruelty, but inefficiency. Not only injustice, but instability. They framed the trade as incompatible with modern progress. This language appealed to those who might not be moved by moral reasoning alone. I pause here because this strategy reveals something important about how change often occurs. Justice rarely advances on moral grounds alone. It is often accompanied, and sometimes enabled, by shifts in economic and political interest. This does not diminish the courage of those who fought for abolition, but it does remind us that systems end when multiple pressures align. For those who lived through this period, the uncertainty was profound. Enslaved people heard conflicting information. Some plantations promised eventual freedom. Others denied change entirely. Trust was scarce, hope fragile. Families weighed impossible choices. Should they flee now, risking capture and punishment, or wait for laws that might never reach them? Free black communities, where they existed, became centers of advocacy and support. They raised funds, shared information, sheltered fugitives, and petitioned governments. Their work was dangerous and exhausting, yet essential. Without them, many abolitionist efforts would have lacked both direction and credibility. Across the Atlantic, African societies felt the shift as well. As demand for enslaved labor declined unevenly, coastal economies built around the trade faltered. Some regions struggled to adapt. Others sought new forms of commerce, with varying success. The long disruption caused by centuries of extraction did not resolve itself simply because ships sailed less frequently. Here again, the consequences of the trade extended far beyond its formal end. I think often of how history marks endings. Dates are recorded. Decrees are cited. Anniversaries observed. Yet for those living through transition, endings rarely feel definitive. They feel tentative, incomplete, provisional. Even where the Atlantic slave trade was effectively suppressed, slavery itself often remained. Plantations continued to operate. Laws continued to define people as property. Freedom, when it came, was delayed, conditional, or accompanied by new forms of coercion. The ocean crossing might end, but the system's logic persisted on land. This is why Part 7 does not close with resolution. It closes with strain. A world in which the old order is weakening, but the new one is not yet fully formed. A world of contradictions, promises, betrayals, and endurance. A world where the future is uncertain, and the past still very much present. I return again to the Atlantic at night. The water is calm. The stars are steady. Somewhere, a patrol ship scans the horizon. Somewhere else, a vessel slips through darkness, its course set by profit rather than law. Somewhere on shore, people wait, listening for news, for change, for something to finally arrive. In the stillness that follows, we breathe. In Part 8, we will follow what came next, the period when slavery itself began to be challenged more directly, when emancipation entered law and life, and when the aftermath of the Atlantic slave trade revealed itself not as closure, but as a new chapter filled with its own struggles and contradictions. For now, rest gently. History is moving, even when it moves slowly. And you are safe to let the story carry you onward, one quiet step at a time. Part 8. Freedom promised, freedom delayed. The night feels very still now, as if even time itself has slowed to listen. We have followed the Atlantic slave trade as it weakened, strained by resistance, law, and shifting economies. Now we arrive at a moment many histories rush through, a moment often spoken of as an ending. Emancipation. Freedom declared. Chains broken. But history, when approached gently, tells us that freedom rarely arrives all at once. I want to walk carefully here, because this part of the story carries both hope and heartbreak, often tangled together so tightly they cannot be separated. In many parts of the Atlantic world, the 19th century brought legal declarations that slavery would end. The language of these laws was formal, precise, and often celebratory. Speeches spoke of progress. Newspapers printed headlines announcing a new era. Bells rang. Prayers were offered. For abolitionists who had labored for decades, these moments felt like vindication, like the long-awaited sunrise after an endless night. And yet, on the ground, reality unfolded far more unevenly. For enslaved people, news of emancipation often arrived slowly, distorted by distance and filtered through those who controlled information. In some places, freedom was announced publicly. In others, it was delayed deliberately. Plantation owners withheld news, hoping to extract as much labor as possible before change became unavoidable. Even when laws were known, enforcement was uncertain. Freedom existed on paper, but not always in practice. I imagine standing in a field at dawn, tools in hand, hearing a rumor carried on the breeze. Someone says slavery has ended somewhere else. Someone else says it will end here soon. Another warns not to trust such talk. Hope rises, cautious and fragile, shaped by generations of disappointment. This uncertainty was itself a form of suffering. Where emancipation was implemented, it was often accompanied by conditions that limited its meaning. Apprenticeship systems required newly freed people to continue working for former owners for years, under the guise of transition. Wages, when offered, were minimal. Contracts favored landowners. mobility was restricted. Surveillance remained constant. Freedom, in these early forms, was narrow and closely monitored. Meanwhile, those who had built wealth and power through slavery were not left adrift. In many regions, governments compensated former enslavers for their loss of property. Payments were made. Debts forgiven. Assets protected. The people who had endured bondage received nothing but the promise of liberty, unaccompanied by land, resources, or security. This imbalance shaped everything that followed. Freed people faced a world that demanded self-sufficiency while denying opportunity. Land ownership was rare. Education limited. Violence remained a constant threat, used to enforce old hierarchies under new names. Laws regulating movement, labor, and assembly emerged quickly, designed to control freedom rather than support it. I pause here, because this is where the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade becomes unmistakably clear. The system did not vanish when ships stopped sailing or laws were passed. It reconfigured itself, embedding its logic into new structures. Yet even in these constrained circumstances, newly freed communities moved forward. Families sought to reunite after decades of separation. Names were chosen or reclaimed. Marriages were formalized. Churches founded. Schools established, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly, always with determination. Education became a central pursuit, seen not only as a practical skill, but as a declaration of humanity long denied. Work continued, because survival required it. People labored as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, artisans, domestic workers, dockhands. They negotiated contracts, asserted rights, built institutions where possible. Progress was slow and frequently interrupted, but it was real. I often think of the emotional complexity of this period. Freedom brought joy, relief, and possibility. It also brought grief, exhaustion, and fear. After generations of control, choice itself could feel overwhelming. How do you plan a future when the past has taught you not to trust tomorrow? Across the Atlantic, former slave-trading nations grappled with their own transformations. Economies adjusted. Industries shifted. Some regions prospered. Others struggled. Debates continued about responsibility, memory, and identity. The trade that had once enriched ports and cities now became something many preferred not to mention at all. Silence returned, but it was a different silence than before. In Africa, the end of the Atlantic slave trade did not immediately bring stability. Centuries of disruption had altered political and social landscapes. New forms of exploitation emerged. Colonial expansion intensified, often justified through the same ideologies that had once supported slavery. The language changed, but the imbalance of power remained. This is an important moment to linger, because it reminds us that systems rarely end in isolation. They leave behind conditions that shape what comes next. The Atlantic slave trade was not simply a chapter that closed. It was a foundation upon which later forms of inequality were built. And yet, people continued to imagine better futures. Movements for civil rights, land reform, and political participation grew gradually, often facing fierce opposition. Each generation inherited both the trauma of the past and the resilience of those who had endured it. Memory became a form of resistance, a way to assert truth against narratives that minimized or erased suffering. I imagine an elder telling a story to a child, quietly, perhaps by firelight. A story about a place across the ocean, about ancestors whose names are not all remembered, but whose presence is felt. These stories did not always follow official histories. They carried emotion, warning, and pride in equal measure. As this part of the night settles, I want to emphasize something gentle but essential. Emancipation was not an endpoint. It was a threshold. What lay beyond it depended on struggle, solidarity, and time. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world, and its ending reshaped it again, but neither transformation was simple or complete. Freedom arrived unevenly, imperfectly, and always under negotiation. As Part 8 draws to a close, I return to a quiet image. A field at dusk, no longer worked under the same conditions, yet still bearing the marks of the past. Footpaths worn deep into the soil. A small home nearby, light glowing softly in a window. Inside, people speak of tomorrow, uncertain but no longer forbidden to hope. In Part 9, we will explore how memory, legacy, and inequality continue to evolve after emancipation, tracing the long shadows cast by the Atlantic slave trade into the modern world. For now, rest gently. Let the story breathe. The ocean remains vast and patient, holding both what has passed and what continues to unfold. And so, we drift onward, quietly, together. Part 9. The long shadow that followed the tide. The night feels especially calm now, as though the world has exhaled and settled into stillness. We have crossed oceans, witnessed declarations of freedom, and listened to the uncertain footsteps of people learning how to live beyond bondage. And yet, history does not loosen its grip so easily. Even when laws change, the past lingers, not loudly, but persistently, shaping the ground beneath each new step. This part of our story lives in that lingering space. After emancipation, the Atlantic slave trade no longer operated as it once had. Ships no longer crossed openly with human cargo. Laws had shifted. Empires spoke the language of progress. But the world that slavery had built did not simply dissolve. It remained present in landscapes, institutions, and habits of thought, quietly guiding what came next. I imagine a town in the late 19th century. Streets are busy. Shops open and close. Children walk to school. On the surface, life appears ordinary. But beneath that ordinariness lies a history that shapes who lives where, who owns land, who holds power, who labors, and who must constantly prove their right to exist. For formerly enslaved people and their descendants, freedom existed alongside restriction. Legal emancipation had not erased the economic imbalance created by centuries of unpaid labor. Wealth remained concentrated in the same hands. Land ownership was rare. Credit difficult to access. Education uneven and often actively denied. New systems emerged to manage this inequality, systems that bore different names but familiar patterns. Labor arrangements such as sharecropping bound families to land they did not own, trapping them in cycles of debt. Laws regulated movement, employment, and behavior, enforcing social hierarchies without explicitly naming slavery. Violence, both public and private, reinforced these structures, reminding communities where power still lay. I pause here because this continuity is essential to understand. The Atlantic slave trade was not only an event in the past. It was a generator of conditions that shaped the future. Memory itself became contested ground. In many societies, there was a desire to move on quickly, to frame slavery as a regrettable but distant chapter, neatly closed. Textbooks simplified. Public monuments celebrated empire and progress while omitting the labor that made them possible. Silence settled over uncomfortable truths. But memory does not disappear simply because it is ignored. Within families and communities, stories were preserved. Names spoken softly. Experiences passed down through generations. These memories were not always complete or precise, but they carried emotional truth. They explained caution. They explained resilience. They explained why freedom still felt fragile. I imagine an elder sitting quietly at the edge of a gathering, watching younger generations move through a world that is changing but not yet transformed. The elder remembers stories told by their own grandparents. Stories of the crossing, of bondage, of survival. These memories inform how they see the present, even when the present insists it is new. Across the Atlantic world, descendants of enslaved people shaped culture in profound ways. Music evolved, blending rhythms and melodies rooted in African traditions with new influences. Foodways reflected creativity under constraint. Language shifted and adapted. These cultural expressions were not merely artistic. They were assertions of identity and continuity in societies that often denied both. At the same time, ideas about race hardened further in response to emancipation. Pseudoscientific theories flourished, attempting to justify inequality through distorted reasoning. These ideas provided a framework for discrimination that extended well beyond the era of slavery, influencing laws, social norms, and institutions. Here again, the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade reveals itself not as a single outcome, but as an ongoing process. In Africa, the consequences were equally enduring. The disruption caused by centuries of forced removal had altered demographics, political structures, and economic patterns. Colonial expansion intensified, often justified through narratives of civilization and progress that echoed earlier justifications for the trade. Resources were extracted. Borders drawn. Local systems reshaped to serve distant interests. The Atlantic slave trade had ended, but extraction continued in new forms. I often find it useful to think of history as sediment rather than sequence. Each layer builds upon the last, compressing it, shaping it, but never fully erasing it. The past remains present, influencing what seems natural or inevitable in the moment. This is especially true when we consider inequality in the modern world. Economic disparities between regions, between communities, between nations are not random. They are rooted in historical processes that concentrated wealth and power over long periods. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the most significant of these processes, linking continents through exploitation and reshaping global development in lasting ways. And yet, alongside this heavy legacy, there has always been movement toward justice. Communities organized. Movements emerged. Laws were challenged and changed. Education expanded. Voices that had long been marginalized demanded to be heard. Progress was uneven and incomplete, but it was real. Each generation pushed against the constraints inherited from the last. I imagine a classroom filled with students learning histories once omitted. I imagine public spaces where stories are told more fully. I imagine conversations that would have been impossible in earlier centuries, now taking place openly, though not without tension. These moments matter. They remind us that legacy is not destiny. The shadow of the Atlantic slave trade is long, but it is not unchangeable. Understanding how that shadow formed is a step toward reshaping what it falls upon. As this part of the night deepens, I want to sit briefly with the idea of responsibility, not as blame, but as awareness. History does not ask us to carry guilt for what we did not personally do. It asks us to recognize how the world we inhabit was shaped, and how our choices either reinforce or challenge those shapes. This awareness can be heavy. It can also be grounding. When we understand the depth of the past, the present becomes clearer. Inequality appears not as accident, but as outcome. Resilience appears not as miracle, but as inheritance. Culture appears not as coincidence, but as continuity. As part 9 draws to a close, I return once more to the ocean. It is night again. The water reflects faint starlight. The ships that once crossed so relentlessly are gone, replaced by different vessels, different cargoes. And yet, the ocean remembers. It holds the echoes of movement, loss, and survival within its vastness. On shore, people continue to live, to love, to struggle, to hope. The past walks beside them, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, but always present. In Part 10, we will move toward reflection, considering how the Atlantic slave trade is remembered today, how history is taught, contested, and re-examined, and how remembering itself becomes an act of care, responsibility, and quiet courage. For now, let your thoughts rest gently. The night is still. The story continues, but there is no rush. History unfolds not only in what happens next, but in how we choose to understand what has already been. And so, we drift softly onward. Part 10. How the story is told, and who is allowed to speak. The night has reached a point of quiet depth now, the kind that feels almost weightless. Outside, the world rests in shadows and low light. Inside this story, we arrive at a different kind of shoreline, not one made of sand or stone, but of memory. This part is not about ships or laws or fields, but about something just as powerful. How the Atlantic slave trade is remembered. How it is explained. And how silence and voice shape what survives. History does not only live in the past. It lives in the stories we choose to tell in the present. I imagine a classroom many years after the end of the Atlantic slave trade. Sunlight filters through tall windows. Students sit at wooden desks, books open before them. A teacher speaks carefully, choosing words that feel safe, measured, distant. Dates are listed. Laws are summarized. A chapter begins and ends neatly. And then the class moves on. For a long time, this was how the Atlantic slave trade existed in public memory. As an episode. A regrettable chapter. Something unfortunate, but resolved. This kind of telling did not happen by accident. In many societies that benefited from the trade, there was a strong desire to emphasize progress rather than responsibility. Abolition was celebrated more than slavery was examined. Emancipation was framed as a moral triumph without fully confronting what had made it necessary. The focus shifted toward national pride, industrial growth, and modern identity. Silence filled the spaces where discomfort lived. Monuments were erected to merchants, generals, and politicians. Buildings were named. Streets carried familiar surnames. Rarely did plaques mention how wealth had been accumulated, or whose labor had built it. The physical landscape absorbed history without explanation, allowing daily life to proceed uninterrupted. For descendants of enslaved people, this silence was not neutral. It shaped how their experiences were understood or misunderstood by the wider world. When history is minimized, its consequences appear exaggerated. When suffering is framed as distant, ongoing inequality is framed as personal failure rather than structural inheritance. I pause here because this is one of the most enduring effects of the Atlantic slave trade. Not only the material damage it caused, but the narratives that followed it. Memory became contested terrain. Within families and communities, stories were preserved with care. They were told at kitchen tables, during long walks, in moments of quiet reflection. These stories did not always align neatly with official histories. They included emotion, contradiction, and detail that textbooks often avoided. A grandmother remembers her own grandmother's words. A song carries meaning beyond its melody. A phrase passed down explains caution, resilience, or mistrust. These forms of memory are not always written, but they are deeply held. At the same time, scholars, activists, and artists began to challenge dominant narratives. They returned to archives. They read shipping records not as numbers, but as evidence of lives interrupted. They studied plantation accounts alongside testimonies. They asked new questions of old documents. Whose voice is missing here? Who wrote this? Who was not allowed to write at all? This work was not welcomed everywhere. Challenging national myths often provokes defensiveness. Some accused historians of dwelling on the past. Others argued that revisiting slavery threatened social cohesion. The phrase "move on" appeared often, as if history were something one could simply set aside. But history does not move on simply because we ask it to. Museums began to change. Exhibits expanded. Memorials were proposed and sometimes resisted. Public debates unfolded over statues, place names, and curricula. These debates were rarely calm because they were never only about the past. They were about identity, belonging, and power in the present. I imagine standing in front of a memorial dedicated to the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. The design is understated. Names may be absent because too many were lost. The space invites reflection rather than spectacle. People stand quietly, reading, thinking, feeling. For some, this is the first time the trade feels real. Art played a crucial role in this reimagining of memory. Novels, poems, music, and visual art gave voice to experiences long ignored. Artists did not merely recount events. They explored interior worlds. Grief, anger, love, survival. Through creativity, history became intimate again. These works did not offer easy comfort. They asked audiences to sit with discomfort, to feel the weight of what had been carried forward. They reminded us that the Atlantic slave trade was not an abstract system, but a human experience repeated millions of times. Education, too, began to shift, though unevenly. Some classrooms expanded their narratives. Others resisted. The question of how to teach this history became deeply political. What should children learn? At what age? With what language? I return again to the idea of voice. For centuries, the Atlantic slave trade was described primarily by those who benefited from it. Their records shaped what was preserved. Their perspectives defined what was considered important. Even abolitionist accounts, while critical, often spoke about enslaved people rather than with them. Recovering voice requires effort and humility. It requires acknowledging that some stories were never written down, and that absence itself is a form of evidence. It requires listening to oral histories, cultural memory, and lived experience alongside official documents. This work is ongoing. It is imperfect, but it matters. I often think of how remembering can be an act of care. To tell the story fully is not to reopen wounds unnecessarily. It is to acknowledge their existence so that healing can be honest rather than superficial. The Atlantic slave trade shaped the modern world in profound ways. Its legacy appears in economic disparities, cultural richness, social tensions, and ongoing struggles for justice. To understand the present without understanding this history is to walk with part of the map missing. As this part of the night settles into stillness, I want to hold on to one quiet truth. Remembering is not about assigning guilt. It is about cultivating understanding. It is about honoring those who endured, resisted, and survived. It is about recognizing how deeply the past informs the present and how awareness can shape the future. I imagine someone closing a book after learning this history more fully than before. They sit quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. The world outside remains unchanged, yet something inside has shifted. This is how history works at its most powerful. Not through spectacle, but through reflection. In Part 11, we will turn gently toward the present, exploring how the Atlantic slave trade continues to influence global conversations about justice, identity, and responsibility, and how people today engage with this history not as distant observers, but as inheritors of its consequences. For now, rest here. The night is calm. The story is held carefully between us. And there is no need to hurry as we drift onward, one quiet understanding at a time. Part 11. Living with the inheritance of history. The night has grown very quiet now, the kind of quiet that invites reflection rather than sleep just yet. We have followed the Atlantic slave trade from its beginnings through its dismantling and into memory itself. Now we arrive at a place that feels closer, more immediate. Not because the events are recent, but because their consequences are still with us. This part of the story lives in the present tense. History, after all, does not end. It settles into us. I imagine walking through a modern city at dusk. Lights flicker on in apartment windows. Traffic hums softly. People move through streets with purpose and habit. On the surface, nothing here appears connected to ships crossing the Atlantic centuries ago. And yet, beneath the routines of modern life, the patterns shaped by that history remain visible, if we know how to look. The Atlantic slave trade altered the distribution of wealth, labor, and power on a global scale. It shaped which regions accumulated resources and which were stripped of them. It influenced who had access to land, education, and political voice, and who was systematically denied those things. These structures did not dissolve when the trade ended. They adapted, hardened, and passed themselves forward. In many societies, descendants of enslaved people continue to navigate systems that were never designed with their full participation in mind. Economic inequality persists. Health disparities remain visible. Educational access varies sharply by geography and background. These patterns are often discussed as modern problems, disconnected from history. But when traced carefully, their roots lead back through generations. I pause here because this connection is often misunderstood. To acknowledge the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is not to suggest that the present is identical to the past. It is to recognize that systems, once built, influence what comes next unless they are deliberately dismantled. Time alone does not undo structure. Awareness and action do. Across the world, conversations about justice, equity, and repair have become more visible. They appear in classrooms, workplaces, art, and public policy. Terms like systemic inequality and historical responsibility enter everyday language. These conversations are not always comfortable. They provoke defensiveness as often as reflection. But their very existence signals a shift. People are asking new questions. What does fairness look like in a world shaped by centuries of imbalance? What responsibilities do nations carry for actions that enriched them long ago? How do we honor memory without becoming trapped by it? How do we address harm without reducing people to roles inherited from the past? There are no simple answers here. Only ongoing dialogue. I imagine a young person learning about the Atlantic slave trade not as a distant chapter, but as part of a larger story that includes their own life. They notice patterns they had not seen before. They begin to ask why neighborhoods look the way they do. Why opportunity feels uneven? Why certain histories were emphasized while others were omitted? This questioning is not an accusation. It is curiosity shaped by context. At the same time, descendants of enslaved people continue to carry both burden and brilliance forward. Cultural contributions born of survival now enrich the world. Music, language, cuisine, spiritual traditions, and modes of expression shaped by the Atlantic world resonate globally. These are not merely remnants of trauma. They are evidence of creativity, adaptation, and endurance. It is important to hold both truths together. The Atlantic slave trade caused immense suffering and loss. It also gave rise, through resilience rather than design, to cultures of profound depth and influence. Recognizing this does not redeem the past, but it honors the people who lived within it. In public spaces, debates continue over how history should be acknowledged. Memorials are proposed. Statues questioned. Reparations discussed. Educational curricula revised. Each of these efforts reflects a broader reckoning with inheritance. Some resist these conversations, fearing division or blame. Others embrace them, seeing honesty as the foundation for trust. Between these positions lies a wide landscape of uncertainty, where societies negotiate how to live with their histories rather than deny them. I often return to the idea that responsibility is not the same as guilt. Responsibility asks us to understand the conditions we have inherited and to consider how our choices either maintain or challenge them. It invites participation rather than shame. On an individual level, this might look like learning more deeply, listening more carefully, questioning assumptions, supporting efforts that expand access and opportunity. None of these actions alone resolve centuries of harm. But together, they shift direction. On a collective level, responsibility requires courage. It asks institutions to examine their origins. It asks nations to consider how wealth was accumulated and at what cost. It asks for policies that address inequality not as anomaly, but as outcome. These are difficult conversations. They move slowly. They encounter resistance. And yet, they continue. I imagine a community gathering held in a space once built through enslaved labor. The building still stands, repurposed. People sit together, speaking openly about history, about present challenges, about hopes for the future. The conversation is imperfect, sometimes tense, but it exists. That alone would have been unthinkable centuries ago. This is how change often unfolds. Not through dramatic resolution, but through sustained engagement. As the night settles deeper, I want to reflect gently on why this story matters for rest, not just for knowledge. Understanding history, even difficult history, can be grounding. It situates our lives within a longer arc. It reminds us that many struggles are not personal failures, but inherited conditions. It also reminds us that change, though slow, is possible, because it has happened before. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world through deliberate choices made over generations. Its legacy continues through patterns that feel natural only because they are familiar. Recognizing this can be unsettling. It can also be clarifying. When we see the shape of the past more clearly, the present becomes less confusing. Injustice appears less mysterious. Resilience appears less accidental. And the future, though uncertain, feels more open to intention. As Part 11 draws toward its quiet close, I return once more to a simple image. A shoreline at night. The ocean moves steadily, indifferent yet constant. The ships are gone, but the water remains, carrying memory in its depths. On land, lights glow. People live their lives, shaped by currents they may or may not fully see. History flows through them all the same. In Part 12, we will begin to draw this long journey inward, reflecting not only on what happened and what followed, but on what it means to sit with such a story quietly, without urgency, allowing understanding to settle rather than overwhelm. For now, rest gently. The night is calm. The story has carried us far, and it will continue, softly, at its own patient pace. Part 12. Sitting with the weight, without turning away. The night has softened even further now. There is a sense of depth to it, not heavy, but expansive, like a wide sky after the last light fades. This is the kind of quiet where stories do not press forward. They settle. They ask to be held gently, without urgency, without defense, without the need to resolve everything at once. Part 12 is about that stillness. We have traced the Atlantic slave trade across oceans and centuries, through ships and laws, resistance and memory, into the present day. Now, instead of moving outward again, I invite you to remain where you are, and simply sit with what has been carried. History, especially history like this, is often approached as something to master. Dates to memorize. Events to explain. Conclusions to reach. But there is another way to be with it. A quieter way. One that allows understanding to arrive gradually, like breath returning after a long walk. I imagine someone alone at night, having just learned this story more fully than before. Perhaps they are not sure what to do with it yet. Perhaps they feel sadness, or heaviness, or confusion, or a mix of emotions that do not fit neatly into language. This moment matters as much as any action that might follow. Because sitting with history without turning away is itself a form of courage. The Atlantic slave trade confronts us with the capacity for systems to normalize harm. Not through chaos alone, but through order. Through paperwork. Through routine. Through people doing their jobs, following rules, trusting that someone else has thought it through. This realization can be unsettling because it removes the comfort of distance. It reminds us that injustice is rarely sustained only by villains. It is sustained by participation, silence, and gradual adjustment. I pause here, not to accuse, but to acknowledge something deeply human. We are all shaped by the systems we inherit. We adapt to them. We find ways to live within them. Sometimes we benefit from them without choosing them consciously. Understanding this is not about shame. It is about awareness. Awareness changes how we see. When we sit quietly with the story of the Atlantic slave trade, certain patterns begin to emerge. We notice how easily people were turned into categories. How distance made suffering abstract. How profit softened moral boundaries. How fear preserved hierarchy. These patterns are not confined to one era. They reappear in different forms, under different names. This is why remembering matters. Not as repetition of pain, but as recognition of pattern. I imagine this awareness settling gently, like dusklight across a room. It does not demand immediate action. It simply illuminates what is already there. It allows questions to form naturally. What do we accept today because it feels normal? Whose labor remains invisible? Whose voices are still filtered through systems that decide what is reasonable or credible? Where does comfort rely on distance? These questions do not need answers tonight. They only need space. For descendants of enslaved people, sitting with this history can feel different. It may resonate not as discovery, but as recognition. Something already known, already felt, now named more clearly. For them, the challenge is often not remembering, but being believed, being heard, being allowed to carry this memory without having to justify it. I want to acknowledge that weight gently. The Atlantic slave trade did not only remove people from places. It disrupted continuity. It fractured ancestry. It forced people to carry history internally, often without external validation. This internal memory can feel like both inheritance and burden. And yet, it is also a source of strength. The survival of culture, of language, of rhythm, of belief, under such conditions is extraordinary. It speaks to a human capacity that systems of domination consistently underestimate. Sitting with this truth allows us to see resilience not as exception, but as constant presence. I often think about how the pace of modern life makes this kind of sitting difficult. We are encouraged to move quickly from awareness to opinion, from learning to reaction. But history does not always benefit from speed. Especially not history that asks us to confront discomfort. There is wisdom in slowing down. In allowing the story to exist without forcing it into a conclusion. In letting understanding arrive not as a single realization, but as a series of small adjustments in how we see the world. The Atlantic slave trade shaped the modern world in ways that are still unfolding. Its legacy is not something we finish understanding. It is something we return to, again and again, with deeper context each time. This does not mean we are trapped in the past. It means the past remains a companion, offering insight if we are willing to listen. I imagine a quiet library at night. Rows of books standing patiently. Each one holding fragments of this long story. No single volume contains it all. No single voice can tell it fully. Understanding emerges through accumulation, through listening across time. This is what it means to live with history rather than seal it away. As this part draws toward rest, I want to offer a gentle reassurance. You do not need to carry everything at once. You do not need to solve history tonight. You only need to allow it to exist within your awareness, without rushing it back into silence. The night is kind to this kind of reflection. Outside, the world continues. Inside, something has shifted, even subtly. A deeper understanding. A quieter attentiveness. A sense of connection across time. In Part 13, we will begin to move toward closure, not by resolving the story, but by gathering its threads, reflecting on what it teaches about humanity, power, and endurance, and how such stories can be carried forward with care rather than exhaustion. For now, rest gently in this stillness. Let the weight be present without pressing down. Let the story breathe, as you do. The ocean remains vast and patient. And you are allowed to drift, softly, onward. Part 13. Gathering the threads without tying them too tightly. The night has reached that hour where thoughts feel slower, softer, as if the world itself is breathing more evenly. This is a good moment to gather what we have carried so far, not to compress it into conclusions, but to hold it gently, noticing how the threads lie beside one another. Part 13 is not about adding new weight to the story. It is about seeing the shape that has already formed. I imagine laying out strands of cloth across a long table. Each strand has its own texture, its own color. None tells the whole story alone. Together, they suggest a pattern. The Atlantic slave trade was many things at once. It was an economic engine. It was a system of violence. It was a network of laws and routines. It was a human catastrophe measured not only in numbers, but in absences. It was also, paradoxically, a crucible in which new cultures emerged through resilience rather than choice. Holding these truths together is not simple. Our minds often want clarity in the form of binaries. Good and evil. Past and present. Ending and beginning. But this history resists such neat framing. It asks us to tolerate complexity without losing our moral center. One thread we have followed closely is power. How it accumulates. How it justifies itself. How it embeds into institutions until it feels natural. The Atlantic slave trade did not rely solely on brute force, though force was always present. It relied on organization, on legal language, on normalization. It depended on many people doing small parts of a larger harm, each part distant enough from the whole to feel manageable. This is an uncomfortable realization, and a necessary one. Because when we understand how power operated then, we are better equipped to notice how it operates now. Not in identical form, but in familiar patterns. Distance. Abstraction. Incentive. Silence. Another thread is endurance. For centuries, enslaved people lived within systems designed to erase autonomy. And yet, autonomy did not vanish. It found quieter expressions. Care given to a child. A song remembered. A story passed along. A moment of refusal. These acts did not dismantle the system on their own, but they sustained humanity within it. I pause here because endurance is often misunderstood. It is sometimes romanticized, framed as strength that negates harm. But endurance does not erase suffering. It exists alongside it. Recognizing endurance is not about celebrating pain. It is about honoring the people who carried life forward despite it. Culture is another thread, and one that runs deep. The Atlantic world produced cultural forms that continue to shape global life. Music born of displacement and adaptation now fills concert halls and living rooms. Foodways created from necessity now define cuisines. Language forged under constraint now carries humor, wisdom, and identity. These creations were not gifts of the system. They were responses to it. Understanding this distinction matters. It allows us to appreciate cultural richness without forgetting the conditions under which it emerged. It reminds us that beauty can arise from suffering without justifying the suffering itself. Memory is a thread that loops back on itself. We have seen how the Atlantic slave trade was remembered, minimized, contested, and reclaimed. How silence shaped public narratives. How families preserved stories when institutions did not. How remembrance became an act of resistance. Memory is not static. It changes as societies change. New questions are asked. Old assumptions challenged. What was once unspoken becomes discussable. What was once accepted becomes troubling. This process can feel destabilizing, especially for those who were taught a simpler version of the past. But destabilization is not destruction. It is recalibration. When we adjust our understanding of history, we adjust how we understand ourselves. I imagine someone realizing that a familiar building, a street name, or a family story is connected to this history in ways they had not considered. The realization is quiet, but it lingers. It does not demand immediate response. It simply reshapes perspective. Another thread is time itself. The Atlantic slave trade unfolded over centuries. Its consequences did not resolve quickly. Expecting clean closure from such a long and complex process misunderstands how history works. Effects compound. Conditions persist. Change arrives unevenly. This understanding can be discouraging if we expect swift resolution. It can also be grounding. It reminds us that the work of justice, like the work of harm, unfolds over long arcs. Progress may be slow, but it is not imaginary. I often think about how history teaches patience without asking for complacency. It shows us that change requires persistence, but also that persistence accumulates. Responsibility is a thread that many hesitate to touch. Not responsibility as blame, but as awareness and choice. We did not create the Atlantic slave trade. We did not choose its structures. But we live in a world shaped by them. What we do with that knowledge matters. Responsibility might look like learning more carefully, listening more openly, supporting efforts that widen opportunity, questioning narratives that oversimplify or erase. None of these actions are dramatic. All of them are meaningful. I return again to the idea of gentleness, because it is easy to become overwhelmed by the weight of this history. Gentleness does not mean disengagement. It means allowing understanding to deepen without collapsing under it. The Atlantic slave trade reveals the capacity for harm within organized systems. It also reveals the capacity for care, creativity, and resistance within constrained lives. Both truths coexist. Neither cancels the other. As Part 13 begins to settle toward rest, I want to leave you with an image that gathers these threads quietly. A long road at dusk. Footprints overlap in the dust, some fresh, some faded. The road was shaped by many travelers over time, some forced, some choosing, many navigating conditions they did not control. The road continues forward, shaped by each step taken upon it. We walk this road not to relive every hardship, but to understand how we arrived here, and how our steps now will shape what comes next. In Part 14, we will begin to gently prepare for closure, reflecting on how stories like this can be carried forward without exhausting us, how they can inform rest rather than disturb it, and how understanding history can become a form of grounding rather than burden. For now, let your thoughts settle. The night is calm. The threads are gathered, not tied tight, simply held. And together we drift onward, quietly, patiently, toward rest. Part 14. carrying the story without carrying the weight. The night has eased into something gentler now. Not the deep stillness that asks for vigilance, but the softer quiet that allows the mind to rest while still remaining aware. This is where stories can be carried without pressing too hard, where understanding settles into the body like a steady breath rather than a held one. Part 14 is about that balance. We have traveled far together through this history. Across oceans and centuries. Through violence and resistance. Through silence and remembrance. Now, as the arc of the story begins to bend toward rest, it is worth asking how such a story can be held without becoming overwhelming. How knowledge can ground rather than burden. How remembrance can coexist with peace. I imagine someone turning off a lamp after reading late into the night. The room dims, but the story does not vanish. It lingers softly, no longer demanding attention, simply present. This is often how understanding arrives at its most sustainable. The Atlantic slave trade is not a story meant to be consumed quickly or resolved neatly. It resists that kind of treatment. But it does not ask us to remain in a state of constant sorrow either. What it asks for is steadiness. A willingness to look, to acknowledge, and then to integrate what we have learned into how we see the world. Integration is quieter than reaction. When we integrate history, it stops feeling like an interruption and begins to feel like context. It informs our awareness without dominating it. It becomes part of how we understand patterns, rather than a separate weight we must carry consciously at all times. I often think of history as a river rather than a monument. A monument stands still, demanding attention whenever we pass it. A river moves continuously, shaping the land subtly over time. The Atlantic slave trade is part of the river that shaped the modern world. We do not need to stand in it constantly to know its influence is there. This perspective can be especially helpful when history feels heavy. There is a tendency, especially among those who learn this story deeply for the first time, to feel an urgency to do something immediately. To respond, to fix, to resolve. While action is important, it is not the only response. Understanding itself is a form of action, particularly when it changes how we move through the world over time. Rest does not erase responsibility. It makes responsibility sustainable. For descendants of enslaved people, rest has often been denied historically, not only physically, but emotionally. The expectation to explain, to educate, to justify pain has been placed unfairly on those who carry this inheritance most directly. Carrying the story without carrying all of its weight means allowing rest to exist alongside remembrance. This matters deeply. A history that only exhausts cannot sustain justice. A memory that only wounds cannot heal. Carrying the story gently allows space for joy, creativity, and future imagining to exist without guilt. I imagine a family gathering where laughter fills the room. Food is shared. Music plays softly. In these moments, history is present not as sorrow, but as continuity. Survival itself becomes visible. The Atlantic slave trade sought to reduce people to labor and loss. Every moment of ordinary joy today stands in quiet defiance of that intention. This is not forgetting. It is living. For those whose ancestors benefited from the trade, carrying the story gently means allowing awareness to inform empathy rather than defensiveness. It means recognizing that understanding history does not diminish personal worth. It expands perspective. It deepens responsibility in ways that are thoughtful rather than performative. It is possible to hold both gratitude for one's own life and honesty about how the world was shaped. These are not opposing truths. I pause here because this balance is delicate. Too much distance risks erasure. Too much immersion risks burnout. Between them lies a space where history becomes wisdom rather than weight. One way this balance appears is in how stories are passed on. Not every telling needs to include every detail. Not every conversation needs to be exhaustive. Sometimes, a story is shared through a single image. A sentence. A moment of reflection. Over time, these fragments accumulate into understanding without overwhelming the listener. This is how oral traditions have survived for centuries. They adapt to the moment, offering what can be received and holding back what might be too heavy for now. I imagine a teacher choosing words carefully, not to soften truth, but to meet students where they are. I imagine a parent answering a question honestly but gently. I imagine a conversation that leaves space for silence rather than filling every moment with explanation. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be restorative rather than suppressive. As we near the quieter end of this journey, I want to emphasize that rest is not disengagement. Rest is how we make room for continuity. It is how understanding deepens rather than fragments. The Atlantic slave trade teaches us many things about power, cruelty, and endurance. It also teaches us about the necessity of care. Care for memory. Care for one another. Care for ourselves as we carry forward what we have learned. I imagine a shoreline once more, because the ocean has accompanied us throughout this story. The water is calm now. The waves arrive gently, receding without force. The horizon is clear. Nothing demands attention. Everything simply is. This is where stories can be set down temporarily, not abandoned, just rested. In this space, understanding does not fade. It settles. It becomes part of the background, informing thought without intruding upon rest. It allows the mind to drift without forgetting. As Part 14 draws toward its quiet close, I want to leave you with a simple reassurance. You are allowed to rest while holding difficult knowledge. You are allowed to carry history without being consumed by it. You are allowed to let understanding coexist with calm. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world. Knowing this matters. But knowing it does not require constant tension. It requires steadiness, compassion, and time. In Part 15, we will move even closer to closure, reflecting on how long histories like this can end not with finality, but with a sense of quiet continuity, like a story set gently beside the bed rather than closed abruptly. For now, let the night hold you. The ocean is still. The story is safe here. And you can drift onward, unhurried, toward rest. Part 15. Where the story rests, without truly ending. The night has thinned into something almost translucent now, the kind of darkness that feels less like an absence of light and more like a gentle veil. This is the hour when stories naturally slow their pace, when they no longer seek to explain or persuade, but simply to exist alongside us. Part 15 lives in that space. We are not closing the story here. We are setting it down carefully. The Atlantic slave trade, as we have seen, does not lend itself to clean endings. It was not a single event that began and finished neatly within the margins of a book. It was a long process, built deliberately, dismantled unevenly, and carried forward through consequences that still shape the world. To demand a definitive ending from such a story is to misunderstand its nature. Instead, we come to a resting place. I imagine placing a book back on a shelf after reading deep into the night. The pages are no longer open, but the story remains present, folded gently into memory. It will be returned to, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not soon, but it will not be forgotten. This is the kind of ending history often offers us. Not resolution, but continuity. One of the most important things the Atlantic slave trade teaches us is how deeply human systems can embed themselves into the fabric of everyday life. It shows us how ideas, once normalized, become invisible. How structures persist not because they are constantly enforced, but because they are rarely questioned. Understanding this does not require us to live in a state of perpetual vigilance. It requires something quieter. Attentiveness. Attentiveness to how the past informs the present. Attentiveness to patterns that repeat under new names. Attentiveness to whose voices are amplified and whose are softened or excluded. These are not tasks to be completed. They are orientations, ways of moving through the world. I think often about how endings are portrayed in history. Textbooks favor dates. Declarations. Moments when something officially stops. But lived experience rarely aligns with those markers. For the people most affected, change arrives slowly, unevenly, often accompanied by new challenges that mirror old ones. This is why closure, in the traditional sense, can feel unsatisfying or even dishonest when applied to histories like this. What we can offer instead is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the Atlantic slave trade caused irreparable harm. That it reshaped continents and lives. That it created inequalities that did not disappear when laws changed. That it also revealed extraordinary endurance, creativity, and humanity among those who survived it. Acknowledgement does not demand constant grief. It asks for honesty. I imagine a quiet moment of acknowledgement happening privately. Someone pauses while walking through a city, noticing a building they have passed many times before. They realize, perhaps for the first time, that it was built during a period when enslaved labor was foundational to the economy. The realization is brief, not overwhelming. It simply adds depth to a familiar place. This is how history often integrates into awareness. Not dramatically, but subtly. As we move toward the final parts of this long journey, I want to emphasize that rest is not forgetfulness. Rest is what allows understanding to become durable. When we push ourselves to remain constantly engaged with pain, we risk numbness. When we allow ourselves to rest, we make space for empathy to remain alive. The Atlantic slave trade does not require us to carry sorrow endlessly. It requires us to carry understanding steadily. For those whose ancestors were directly harmed by this system, rest can be an act of reclamation. To live fully, to find joy, to imagine futures unburdened by constant explanation is not a betrayal of memory. It is a continuation of survival. For those whose ancestors benefited, rest allows reflection without defensiveness. It allows learning without paralysis. It allows responsibility to be thoughtful rather than reactive. Both positions meet here, in this quieter space, where the story is no longer pressing forward but still present. I find it helpful to think of the Atlantic slave trade as a deep root rather than a closed chapter. Roots remain underground, shaping what grows above them. We do not see them daily, but they influence the strength, direction, and health of what emerges. Understanding the root does not mean staring at the ground forever. It means knowing what nourishes or constrains what we see. As the night moves closer to rest, I want to return one final time, in this part, to the ocean. The Atlantic is calm now. Its surface reflects the faintest light. There are no ships in sight. No sense of urgency. Just water moving as it always has, indifferent yet enduring. It holds memory not because it chooses to, but because memory passed through it. On the shore, people live their lives. Children sleep. Elders rest. Conversations end softly. Tomorrow will come. This is where the story rests for now. Not concluded. Not resolved. Simply placed gently beside us, available when needed, quiet when not. In part 16, we will begin the final stretch of this journey, moving toward the closing reflections that allow the story to fade into the background where it belongs, not erased, but integrated, like a steady hum beneath the surface of thought. For now, let yourself rest here. The work of understanding has been done carefully. There is nothing more you need to hold tonight. The night is kind. The story is safe. And you may drift, slowly and peacefully, onward. Part 16. The quiet work that continues after the telling. The night is very still now. Not empty, not silent, but settled, like a lake after the wind has passed. This is the hour when stories no longer need to speak loudly to be present. They linger gently, woven into the background of thought, doing their quiet work without asking for attention. Part 16 is about that quiet work. We have spent many hours with this history, letting it unfold slowly, without force. And now, as the story begins to recede into rest, it is worth noticing what remains after the telling has softened. Not conclusions. Not directives. But something subtler. A shift in awareness. A steadier way of seeing. The Atlantic slave trade does not demand that we carry its details endlessly. What it leaves us with is orientation. I imagine someone waking the morning after hearing this story. Light enters the room gradually. The day begins as it always has. Coffee is poured. Shoes are tied. The world looks the same. And yet, something has changed, not dramatically, but quietly. Familiar things are now held with a slightly deeper context. This is how understanding settles when it is allowed to rest. The quiet work of history happens not in moments of attention, but in moments of recognition. When patterns are noticed. When assumptions are gently questioned. When empathy arises without being forced. It might appear as a pause before judgment. A curiosity about how something came to be. A willingness to listen a little longer. These are small shifts. They are also how long histories continue to shape the present. One of the enduring lessons of the Atlantic slave trade is that harm does not require constant intention to persist. It requires maintenance through habit, silence, and convenience. The opposite is also true. Change does not always arrive through dramatic intervention. Sometimes it arrives through sustained, ordinary awareness. I pause here because this idea can be comforting. It means that responsibility does not require constant strain. It means that participation in a more just world can be quiet, thoughtful, and integrated into daily life. It does not always announce itself. This is especially important for histories that carry pain. When people feel they must always perform engagement with suffering, exhaustion follows. When engagement becomes woven into how one sees rather than how one reacts, it becomes sustainable. The Atlantic slave trade, once learned deeply, changes the texture of understanding without needing to be revisited constantly. It becomes part of the background, informing perspective the way gravity informs movement. Unseen, but essential. I think again of how systems endure. They endure because they are built into the ordinary, into schedules, into expectations, into what feels normal. Undoing their influence requires a similar quiet persistence, a willingness to notice, a refusal to accept inevitability, a commitment to curiosity over certainty. None of this needs to happen quickly. Time is an ally here. Just as the trade unfolded over centuries, its reckoning unfolds slowly as well. Each generation engages with it differently, bringing new questions and new contexts. There is no final understanding to be reached, only deeper ones. This can feel frustrating to those who want closure. It can also be grounding. It reminds us that we are not responsible for finishing history. We are responsible for how we inhabit it. I imagine someone encountering a conversation about inequality, identity, or justice in the present day. Perhaps they listen differently now. Perhaps they recognize echoes they might have missed before. Perhaps they feel less compelled to argue and more inclined to understand. This is the quiet work at play. It does not demand perfection. It allows for learning. It leaves room for uncertainty without disengagement. For descendants of enslaved people, this quiet work often involves balancing remembrance with living, carrying knowledge without letting it overshadow joy, honoring ancestors without being confined by their suffering, choosing when to speak and when to rest. This balance is not fixed. It shifts across time and circumstance. And that is allowed. For descendants of those who benefited from the trade, the quiet work may involve learning without defensiveness, accepting discomfort without retreat, understanding that awareness does not diminish one's place in the world. It deepens it. Both paths require gentleness. As we move closer to the final resting place of this long story, I want to emphasize something important. The Atlantic slave trade is not a story that asks to be carried alone. It exists within a larger human story of power, adaptation, harm, and care. When we situate it there, it becomes less isolating and more instructive. It teaches us that systems are made by people. That people can change systems. That change is rarely neat, rarely fast, but often cumulative. That endurance matters. That memory matters. That rest matters too. I return once more to the image of the ocean, because it has accompanied us from the beginning. The water moves gently now. There is no sense of urgency. It has carried countless stories across its surface and into its depths. It does not cling to them. It holds them without effort. We can learn something from that. To hold history without clinging. To allow it to inform without overwhelming. To let it move with us rather than weigh us down. As part 16 draws toward its quiet close, I want to reassure you of something simple. You have listened. You have stayed present. That is enough for now. There is no test to pass. No action required in this moment. The understanding you have gained will continue to work quietly, shaping perspective in ways you may not even notice immediately. This is how deep learning often feels. Not like revelation, but like alignment. In part 17, we will move even closer to the end of our journey, allowing the story to fade further into calm reflection, preparing gently for the final rest where gratitude, continuity, and quiet closure meet. For now, let yourself rest here, The night is steady. The work continues softly, without effort. And you may drift onward, peaceful and unhurried, toward the last quiet chapters of this long telling. Part 17. When the story becomes a low, steady presence. The night is nearing its deepest calm now. Not the kind of darkness that feels unknown, but the kind that feels familiar and safe, like a room you know well even with the lights turned low. This is the hour when stories no longer unfold. They hum. They settle into the background, steady and unobtrusive, like a distant tide. Part 17 is where the story becomes that hum. We are no longer moving through events or ideas. We are resting with what remains after so much listening. The Atlantic slave trade, once traced carefully from beginning to aftermath, now exists not as a narrative demanding attention, but as a quiet presence shaping how the world is understood. This is often how the most important histories stay with us. I imagine someone drifting towards sleep after hearing this story over many nights. Thoughts come and go, no longer sharp or insistent. Images appear briefly and dissolve. The mind does not rehearse details. It simply knows, in a deeper way, that something has been learned. This knowing is not loud. It does not argue. It does not demand response. It simply adjusts the lens through which the world is seen. When history reaches this place, it has done its work. The Atlantic slave trade no longer needs to be actively recalled to matter. It has already shaped understanding. It has already informed perspective. It has already placed certain questions gently at the edges of thought, ready to surface when needed. This is not forgetting. It is integration. I want to linger here because this stage of understanding is rarely discussed. We talk often about learning and action, but less about what happens in between. About how knowledge becomes part of us without constant effort. This is where rest and remembrance meet. One of the quiet gifts of engaging with history in this way is that it reduces fear. When we allow ourselves to understand the past fully, without rushing or defending, it loses some of its power to unsettle us unexpectedly. It becomes familiar terrain rather than an unspoken shadow. The Atlantic slave trade, for many, exists as a shadow until it is named, explored, and acknowledged. Once it is, it can take its place as part of a larger human story rather than looming as something undefined. I imagine someone encountering a news story, a conversation, or a social issue that touches on inequality or injustice. They do not feel shocked or overwhelmed. They recognize the pattern. They understand that this moment exists within a longer history. This recognition brings clarity rather than despair. This is the low, steady presence at work. It does not remove emotion. It stabilizes it. For descendants of enslaved people, this presence may feel like a quiet companion. Something that has always been there, now acknowledged more openly. It does not demand explanation. It does not require constant vigilance. It simply exists, allowing space for both remembrance and rest. For others, this presence may feel newer. Something that once sat outside awareness now feels gently integrated. It no longer provokes defensiveness or urgency. It invites attentiveness. Both experiences are valid. Both represent movement toward steadiness. I often think of how the ocean behaves at night. The waves do not stop, but they soften. Their sound becomes rhythmic, predictable, almost reassuring. You do not count each wave. You simply know they are there. History, when fully integrated, behaves the same way. The Atlantic slave trade remains part of the world's foundation. Its effects ripple outward in ways that are sometimes visible, sometimes subtle. But when we have learned to recognize its presence, we do not need to chase every ripple. We trust that our awareness will notice what matters. This trust is important. Without it, we feel the need to constantly re-engage, to re-justify, to re-explain. With it, we can move through the world with calm attentiveness, responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. As we approach the final parts of this journey, I want to emphasize that there is no expectation of constant engagement. History does not require vigilance to be honored. It requires honesty, which can be quiet. The Atlantic slave trade teaches us about the consequences of dehumanization. It also teaches us about the human capacity to endure, adapt, and carry meaning forward. These lessons do not expire. They simply settle into wisdom. I imagine an elder sitting comfortably in the evening, perhaps near a window, watching the sky darken. They have lived with this history for a long time, whether through study, memory, or inheritance. It no longer overwhelms them. It informs them. It shapes how they see the world, how they care for others, how they choose to speak or remain silent. This elder does not feel the need to retell the story constantly. They know when to share and when to rest. This discernment is part of maturity, both personal and collective. As a society, reaching this stage of relationship with history takes time. It requires moving beyond denial and beyond constant agitation into something steadier. Not complacency, but grounded awareness. This is the direction we have been drifting toward. The Atlantic slave trade, in this quiet hour, is no longer a story being told. It is a story being held. As part 17 settles into stillness, I return one last time, in this part, to the image that has accompanied us throughout. The Atlantic Ocean at night. Its surface dark and reflective. No ships crossing. No urgency. Just water moving as it always has, carrying memory without strain. On land, people sleep. Dreams come and go. The world continues, shaped by countless histories, each one influencing the present in ways both seen and unseen. This is where the story belongs now. Not at the center of attention, but as a steady presence beneath it. In part 18, we will move into the final reflections, allowing gratitude, continuity, and gentle closure to emerge naturally, without forcing an ending where none truly exists. For now, let yourself rest here. The night is calm. The story has become part of the quiet. And you may drift onward, peaceful and unburdened, toward the final moments of this long, careful telling. Part 18. Gratitude for the listening and the shape of continuity. The night feels almost complete now, like a circle gently closing without a sound. There is a softness to the air, a sense that nothing more needs to be added. This is the hour for gratitude, not the kind spoken aloud in bright rooms, but the quieter kind that settles inward, steady and sincere. Part 18 is shaped by that feeling. When a long story reaches this point, it is not the events that remain most clearly, but the act of listening itself. The patience it required. The openness it invited. The way understanding grew not through urgency, but through presence. To listen to a history like the Atlantic slave trade in this way is no small thing. It asks for attention without defensiveness, compassion without overwhelm, steadiness without detachment. And that listening deserves acknowledgement. I imagine the story itself pausing here, not to bow or conclude, but to breathe. To recognize that being heard carefully is part of what restores dignity to histories that were once reduced to numbers, cargo, and silence. Listening does not change the past, but it changes the present relationship to it. That change matters. Gratitude, in this context, is not celebration. It is recognition. Recognition of the lives that endured. Recognition of the voices that persisted. Recognition of the listeners who chose not to turn away. Recognition of the quiet work that understanding does long after the telling fades. I think often about continuity because this story has always been about it. Continuity of harm, yes. Systems repeating themselves under new names. Patterns resurfacing across generations. But also continuity of care. Of resistance. Of creativity. Of memory. Of people choosing, again and again, to carry forward what could not be taken from them. This continuity does not announce itself loudly. It appears in ordinary places. In the way music is played at gatherings. In recipes passed from hand to hand. In phrases that carry history without explanation. In gestures of care learned long ago. These things do not require us to think of the Atlantic slave trade every time they appear. And yet, they exist because people survived it. Gratitude can live here, without strain. I imagine someone reflecting quietly, not on facts or arguments, but on the simple reality that so many lives were lived despite forces designed to erase them. That entire cultures continued, adapted, and flourished in ways that could not be fully controlled. That the human capacity for meaning proved stronger than systems built to deny it. This is not romanticizing suffering. It is acknowledging survival. As the story has softened, it has revealed something important about time. Time does not heal everything on its own, but it creates space. Space for reckoning. Space for memory to be reshaped. Space for relationships to history to mature. The Atlantic slave trade existed for centuries. Its consequences will continue to unfold for centuries more. This does not mean we are trapped within it. It means we are situated within a long human story, one that continues to evolve. Continuity does not imply inevitability. It implies connection. I pause here to reflect on how stories like this are often framed as warnings. And they are. They show us what happens when dehumanization becomes routine. When profit overrides empathy. When distance replaces accountability. These lessons are real and necessary. But there is another lesson here too, one that is quieter. It is the lesson of listening itself. When people listen carefully to history, without rushing to simplify or defend, something shifts. The story becomes less about proving a point and more about understanding a process. Less about judgment and more about context. Less about reaction and more about wisdom. This is the kind of listening that builds continuity rather than fracture. I imagine a future generation encountering this history not as something newly revealed or newly denied, but as something already integrated into shared understanding. Not hidden. Not sensationalized. Simply known. Taught with care. Remembered with respect. Discussed without fear. This future is not guaranteed. But it is imaginable. And imagination is often where continuity begins. Gratitude also belongs to the unnamed. To the millions whose names were not recorded. To the stories that did not survive intact. To the lives lived quietly, without recognition. Their presence shaped the world regardless. Gratitude honors that presence without requiring details that were never preserved. It is enough to know that they lived, that they endured, that they mattered. As the night deepens toward rest, I want to acknowledge one more form of gratitude. Gratitude for the ability to rest with this story. For centuries, many could not rest. Their bodies were worked relentlessly. Their nights were not safe. Their futures were not their own. The ability to listen calmly, to reflect peacefully, to set the story down gently is itself something shaped by the long arc of history. Rest, here, becomes meaningful. Not as escape, but as continuation. A quiet refusal to let history exist only as trauma. A way of allowing memory to coexist with calm. I imagine someone turning towards sleep now, the story no longer active in thought, but present somewhere deeper. It does not intrude. It does not demand. It simply exists as part of a broader understanding of the world. This is the shape of continuity at its most gentle. The Atlantic slave trade does not disappear as the story winds down. It becomes part of the background fabric of understanding, influencing how things are seen, without overwhelming the senses. As Part 18 settles into stillness, I return once more to the image that has carried us through the entire journey. The Atlantic Ocean at rest. The horizon faint but steady. No urgency. No spectacle. Just movement continuing, as it always has. The ocean does not close chapters. It carries them forward. And so do we. In Part 19, we will enter the final reflections, allowing the story to loosen its hold even further, offering a sense of quiet completion without finality, a gentle easing into rest. For now, let gratitude linger softly. Let continuity feel reassuring rather than heavy. The night is kind. The story has been heard. And you may drift onward, unhurried, toward the last quiet moments of this long and careful telling. Part 19. Letting the story fade into the background. The night is almost complete now. Not ending, exactly, but easing into that soft space just before sleep fully takes hold. This is the hour when thoughts no longer line up in clear sequences. They drift. They overlap. They become less about words and more about feeling. It is here that a long story begins to loosen its edges, not disappearing, but blending gently into the background of awareness. Part 19 lives in that gentle fading. We have walked slowly through centuries of history, carrying the Atlantic slave trade carefully, never rushing, never forcing resolution. Now, the story does not need to be held at the front of the mind. It has earned its place further back, settled, steady, available without insistence. This is often the most peaceful relationship we can have with difficult knowledge. I imagine a listener who no longer feels the need to replay each part of the story. The details have already found their place. What remains is a sense of shape. A quiet understanding of how the world came to be arranged as it is. A calm awareness that certain patterns did not arise by accident. This awareness does not press for reaction. It simply exists. Letting a story fade into the background does not mean it loses importance. It means it has been integrated deeply enough that it no longer needs constant attention. Like a well-learned path, it guides movement without conscious effort. The Atlantic slave trade, once approached in this way, becomes less of an emotional interruption and more of a steady reference point. When questions of justice, inequality, or human dignity arise, the context is already there. There is no need to search for it. It arrives naturally. This is what it means for history to become wisdom. I pause here because this stage is often mistaken for disengagement. It is not. Disengagement avoids history. Integration absorbs it. One turns away. The other allows it to rest. The difference matters. Disengagement creates blind spots. Integration creates clarity. I imagine someone moving through daily life, making ordinary choices. They notice how certain neighborhoods are shaped, how labor is valued, how opportunity is distributed. They do not feel compelled to explain everything back to the Atlantic slave trade, and yet they understand that the roots are there. This understanding tempers assumptions. It softens judgment. It invites curiosity. That is the story doing its quiet work. As we approach the final resting point of this long telling, it is worth noticing how little effort this now requires. The mind does not strain to remember. The heart does not brace itself. The story is simply present, like a low light left on in another room. This is where rest becomes possible. The Atlantic slave trade was built on relentless motion. Ships crossing oceans. Bodies forced to labor without pause. Systems designed to extract endlessly. Rest was denied by design. To allow the story of that system to end in rest is, in its own way, a quiet reversal. I imagine the descendants of those who endured that restlessness now claiming calm moments for themselves. Sitting without urgency. Sleeping without fear. Dreaming without permission. These moments do not erase history. They honor survival by refusing to let the past dictate the present. For those learning this history from a distance, rest allows empathy to remain intact. When we push ourselves to stay constantly engaged with suffering, numbness can follow. When we allow the story to settle, empathy stays accessible. This balance is gentle. It does not announce itself. It simply works. As the story fades into the background, something else becomes more visible. The present moment. The room you are in. The sound of your own breathing. The steady passage of time, moving forward without demand. This, too, matters. History gains meaning not only through what it tells us about the past, but through how it allows us to inhabit the present more fully. When we are no longer pulled back by unresolved tension, we can be more present where we are. I imagine someone listening to the ocean at night, perhaps from a distance. They are not thinking about ships or crossings. They are simply listening to waves arriving and receding. The sound is familiar, comforting. It holds no immediate narrative, and yet it carries everything that has passed through it. This is the relationship we are reaching now. The Atlantic slave trade has been heard. Its weight acknowledged. Its complexity respected. Now it can rest. Not forgotten. Not minimized. Just set gently into the larger landscape of understanding, where it belongs. As Part 19 settles further into stillness, I want to offer a quiet reassurance. You do not need to hold this story tightly. It will not slip away. What you have learned is already part of you. It will surface when needed and remain quiet when not. This is how deep stories stay with us. The mind knows when to let go and when to remember. The body knows when to rest. The night knows how to hold both. I imagine the final pages of a book being turned slowly, not because the reader is eager to finish, but because the end has arrived naturally. There is no rush. No sense of loss. Just a gentle closing, with the understanding that the story can always be returned to. The Atlantic slave trade does not require vigilance to be honored. It requires presence, which you have given. As the night moves toward its final quiet moments, the story loosens its grip completely. It becomes a background presence, steady and calm, no longer asking to be examined, only acknowledged. In Part 20, the final part of this long journey, we will allow the story to rest fully, offering a quiet closing reflection that invites peace rather than conclusion, and gratitude rather than finality. For now, let yourself drift. The night is deep and kind. The story has found its place. And you may rest, gently and completely, as we move toward the final soft close. Part 20. The story set down and the night left intact. The night has reached its final quiet now. Not an ending marked by a sound or a signal, but a gentle easing, like the last ripple on water after something has passed through. This is the hour when even long stories learn how to rest. Not by disappearing, but by becoming still. This is where we set the story down. Not because it has been finished in the way books are finished, but because it has been carried long enough to find its place. The Atlantic slave trade, once a force of relentless motion, now lies quietly within the wider landscape of understanding, no longer demanding attention, no longer pulling at the edges of thought. It is simply there. I imagine the room you are in now. The light is low. The world outside has slowed. There is nothing you need to hold, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember precisely. The story has already done its work, and it does not ask more of you tonight. This final part is not a conclusion. It is a settling. Throughout this long journey, we resisted the urge to rush. We did not compress centuries into slogans. We did not flatten human lives into abstractions. We allowed space for complexity, for discomfort, for endurance, and finally, for calm. That pacing matters, because history itself rarely moves quickly, and understanding moves even more slowly. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped the world through repetition. Through ships crossing again and again. Through systems reinforcing themselves day after day. Through habits that made cruelty feel ordinary. To tell its story slowly is to undo that rhythm, to replace urgency with attentiveness. And attentiveness changes things. Now, as the story rests, what remains is not a list of facts, but a posture. A way of holding history without flinching and without strain. A steadiness that allows memory to exist without becoming intrusive. A recognition that the past does not vanish when we stop speaking of it, and that it does not need constant retelling to remain real. I want to pause here and speak gently to the listener. You have not been asked to judge. You have not been asked to perform grief. You have not been asked to carry responsibility beyond what is sustainable. You have been asked only to listen, to remain present, and to allow the story to pass through you at a human pace. That is enough. The Atlantic slave trade was built on denial of rest. Bodies denied rest. Minds denied rest. Futures denied rest. To end this story in rest is not symbolic. It is corrective. It allows the telling itself to refuse the logic of the system it describes. Nothing here needs to be resolved tonight. If questions remain, they can wait. If emotions remain, they can soften. If understanding continues to deepen, it will do so quietly, over time. I imagine the story now as an object placed gently on a table beside the bed. Not shut away in a drawer. Not held tightly in hand. Simply placed there, visible, acknowledged, at ease. It will still be there in the morning. It will still be there when needed. It does not require vigilance to exist. This is how long histories should be treated when the day is done. The Atlantic slave trade is not a moral lesson to be memorized. It is a human history to be understood. An understanding, when complete enough for now, allows us to rest without forgetting. I return one last time to the ocean, because it has carried us from the very beginning. The Atlantic is calm now. No crossings. No urgency. Just water moving as it always has, under moonlight, under stars, under time. It holds everything without effort. It does not distinguish between past and present. It simply exists, wide and patient. On its shores, life continues. People sleep. People dream. People wake tomorrow carrying histories they may or may not consciously recall, shaped by forces they did not choose, living lives that still contain joy, care, and meaning. This is not contradiction. This is continuity. The story does not end because life does not end. It flows forward, reshaped by awareness, softened by rest, guided by memory rather than driven by it. As background historian, I step back now, not to disappear, but to allow silence to take over where words are no longer needed. The work of telling is complete for tonight. The work of being with the story continues quietly, without effort, without demand. You do not need to hold anything else. The night is intact. The story is safe. You are allowed to drift. Let your thoughts slow. Let your breathing deepen. Let the world fade gently at the edges. This history has been carried carefully, and now it rests. And so do you. The night has fully settled now, and with it, a sense of calm completion. The story we have carried together no longer asks for attention. It rests, quietly and securely, where it belongs. Not forgotten. Not set aside. Simply at peace. I want to offer a soft word of gratitude before we part for the night. Thank you for listening slowly. Thank you for allowing the story to unfold without rushing it toward conclusions. Thank you for staying present with history that asked for patience, care, and steadiness. These stories are not easy ones, but they are important ones. And the way you listened mattered. You did not consume the story. You accompanied it. That is a rare and meaningful thing. As background historian, my role has been to guide, not to press. To walk beside you rather than ahead of you. And now, gently, I step back, allowing the quiet to take over where words no longer serve. There is nothing more you need to hold tonight. The Atlantic Ocean has grown still in our imagination. The long crossings are over. The voices have softened. The echoes have found their place beneath the surface of understanding, where they can remain without disturbing rest. If any thoughts linger, let them drift. If any images return, let them pass. If emotions remain, let them soften with the rhythm of your breathing. You are not required to resolve history before sleep. Understanding does not demand wakefulness. Often, it deepens best when the mind is allowed to rest. The world outside continues quietly. Somewhere, a light flickers off. Somewhere, the wind moves through trees. Somewhere, the tide turns without announcement. All of it steady. all of it calm. Tonight, you can drift knowing that the story has been honored. It has been carried carefully and set down gently. It will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, whenever you wish to return. For now, it asks nothing of you. Let your body relax. Let your thoughts slow. Let the night hold you safely. Thank you for sharing this time, this listening, this stillness. Sleep peacefully.